Welcome to the Equity Institute's podcast on the purpose of public education with me, your host, Vincent Perez. Today, we invite James Boutin to share his wisdom as a public educator for 14 years and someone who is deeply examining the workings of oppression in our culture. I first met James at a CHITO conference of the Chicanx Institute for Teaching and Organizing when he came for a 3-day institute at the CISPAS Learning Center years ago. I have since engaged with James and seeing him and his career develop into a very thoughtful and compassionate practice. Please welcome James Boutin. Welcome, James. I'm so grateful that you're here spending some time with us. For our listeners, could you please share a little bit about who you are and your connection to public education?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, thank you, first and foremost, for the invitation. It's really an honor and privilege to be able to talk about this particular topic with you. So my background is I was a high school teacher in public schools for 14 years. I started my teaching career in East Tennessee and taught in several different districts across the United States, including New York City, Washington, D.C., and most recently here in Western Washington in the Highland School District. And for most of that time, I was also an active union organizer around social justice and community-based issues. And today I call myself an educator, facilitator, and trainer for social change. Working with public schools to kind of focus on what I think of as a pedagogy of who we are, or a pedagogy of who and how we are. And my heart is very much in public schools, so it's wonderful to be talking about this with you today.
I'm curious, even before I ask my big question of what is the purpose of public education and what led you to this pathway that you're on now in terms of supporting practitioners who are in schools?
Yeah. I think for most of my time in public education, I'm like very much a systems thinker. I always want to understand, how does the forest work? And I know there are people who focus on the trees, and that's also really important, but I want to know like the big patterns. And so I was really invested in systems transformation especially as an organizer. And I think I just kept running into these barriers, I think, and I know the theory of how systems transformation is supposed to work. I know how we all behave as gatekeepers. I know how we need to be in community. I know how we need to collaborate. But time and time again, I would run into these conflicts or these personal challenges in those organizing spaces that just continued to kill the work. And it just kind of hit me like, if we're going to do systems transformation, we have got to be working on personal transformation at the same time. And so last 4 years, I've been investing my time into understanding, what does personal transformation take? And how do we take that work of personal transformation and align it with systems transformation? And of course, in between those two things is a lot of relational work. And I think that work can be really powerful for schools.
I've been thinking about the word relationship, right? Especially as schools begin and there's a lot of talk about relationship. I was like breaking it down on a drive by myself, like to relate, to be in relation. Like, what does that really mean on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment even basis to relate? Yeah. So I've been holding that and wanted to explore that as well with students and educators. So this may kind of frame this big question. I'm curious for you, with that experience and that perspective, what is the purpose of public education?
I want to come back to that question that you were not right now, but the question about relationship and relating. Maybe we can find a way to converse about that. I think that's so important. And maybe it is at the heart of the question of what is the purpose of public education, actually. Probably the definition, I heard this definition from Pasi Sahlberg like 10 years ago. He's the former Minister of Education and Culture in Finland. I think that was his title. And he said that when he was in that work, they thought of the purpose of education as helping all students become who they are. And when he said that, I was like, that's the one, that's it, that's the one I'm using. And I think also, that the word public education is quite profound. To me, it's like quite a profound ideal that we would offer a public for something to be public, to offer to all people, regardless of their race or belief system or social class or whatever. Like, it's an incredible thing that as a species, we think we can do that in a pluralist society with extremely different viewpoints, and to do that well, and so that all people can become who they are. That really moves me. I feel emotional about that idea, and what you were bringing up early, like what we were both bringing up early about relationship, like that seems to me that seems to me to be at the heart of it. How do we support relationality in growth? And how does growth come out of relationality? Because certainly those are like super related, right?
Well, I think even for self, right? What is my relation to self? As I have, grown now almost to my 50s, it's really in my 40s that this has occurred in a big, big way. I would say my early 20s and late 40s have been the big kind of peaks of really thinking and engaging self, really to self and understanding self. Of course, I think always in relation to other, especially those closest to us. And for me as a husband, as a father, but as a professional back in these institutions, this is where we get the practice as well, right? To relate to the rest of the world. I'm curious, are there any specific philosophies in education, approaches, frameworks that you've seen in practice or in policy that really foster this idea of becoming your full, Kim uses the language, your best and most self. And the other day I heard this idea of not to be the best in the world, but to be the best for the world. There's something about you tapping into your calling, your inclinations, your tendencies that fulfill you, and give you meaning in the world. So I'm curious, what have you seen really work out there?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of models, like the names of the models that I think of most quickly are things like constructivism or Montessori or Freirean critical pedagogies, or I mean, there was an organization that started in the 80s and kind of recently has really died out called the Coalition of Essential Schools. That was a movement towards democratizing schooling in the United States. And of course, there are many other democratizing education movements in the US. But I was really deeply involved with the CES, is what it was known as, Coalition of Essential Schools, for a while. I was so moved by their work. I mean, it's just incredible, the idea that, students can learn to use power. They can learn to create their own knowledge. They can learn to participate in budgeting processes. That's all, of course, true. Certainly ethnic studies paradigms, things that I know that you've been involved with, the Shito and the Nawe Olin. And I mean, I think really any pedagogical model or schooling framework that acknowledges that human beings both need to and love to learn. And that although, of course, it is challenging at times, we can construct our own knowledge, not only as individuals, but also in community, and also as a result of the lineage and culture that our ancestors have passed down to us, and that we act as part of a longer lineage and human potential. Any framework that acknowledges that power is involved in the construction of knowledge, and certainly power is involved in a claim to distribute knowledge, like a school district or a university can make, and that we should be skeptical of that, not cynical, but always critically questioning how those who claim to distribute knowledge might be using that power. And certainly any model that acknowledges that culture is a third party, that here you and I are speaking, but also there is culture in between us, and that is constructing our relationship and constructing the knowledge that we create. And we are on, I think as a species, I like to think long term, but I think we're on a path. We are constantly attempting to create and make sense of our universe. And we need each other for that. So maybe that's where that relationship comes back in. And as you were speaking to earlier, how do we do that from a sense of self? What is our sense of self? And how does that also get constructed and change over time? So to me, I think, if you go back to Pasi Sahlberg's definition, education should support students to become who they are. If we really took that seriously, I think we would have to really broaden our sense of what education is. It's from the time you're born to the time you die experience. And certainly it doesn't only happen in schools. It also happens in relationship, and it happens in community. And that's connected to everything. That's connected to our economic system. It's connected to our politics. It's connected to our transportation. I mean, there's so much that's connected to. So it's an ideal, I think, that could pervade society ultimately.
So if it fosters and grows who we are, the kind of age-old human question of who am I? It comes up for me. It's a question I've been asking since I was a young person. Last month, I got to go to a men's circle with the National Compadres Network. And I noted that there was an elder in his 80s still asking the question, who am I? And so I noted to myself, spoke it out to one of my friends there as we were processing. I was like, I thought I had to have an answer to that question, especially by now. And it turns out, look at this elder still asking. It was something really beautiful and exploratory, that this is kind of a lifelong question.
Yeah.
And so if schools can help us begin to learn how to investigate that and decipher and find some discernment even about, what I'm inclined to, what I'm not, and then how I want to grow and be very intentional in these areas. For me in particular, it's accountability. Like the largest growth is really looking in the mirror and thinking about self and how I can hold myself accountable, especially when I do harm.
Yeah. Throws that other piece of relationality in there. What does accountability mean to learning and self as well? Yeah.
That's where conversation's leading me, is just a celebration of the question.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, especially from a systems perspective, what do you see as some of the most significant challenges or obstacles in achieving this end to actually foster and grow the knowledge of self into what I posit, right, as a stable human being, that you can carry that knowledge, deal with life's hardships, find careers, manage your relationships in a good way? What challenges do you see? And then in your work right now, right, you're even, I think, planning to combat some of those challenges. So could you speak a little bit about how your approach to that?
Maybe it would be interesting to frame that question around what we believe democracy could be. I think, there's a lot of questions when in the debate or discourse around public schooling that centers on learning. And that's, of course, totally reasonable and appropriate. And I often, of course, agree with that, but also want to center it on democracy. What do we believe about democracy? What do we believe democracy could be? And one of the paradigms I am heavily influenced by is a paradigm called process work or process-oriented psychology. And within that paradigm, there's this idea of deep democracy, this idea that we, at sort of the highest level, democracy could be a welcoming of all of our parts, regardless of how, like, on the surface, they may look to be extraordinarily problematic and challenging, but that at least there is at least 1% wisdom in everything that we do. And how do we welcome that into the room and be with that and learn from that and grow our awareness around that as we grow our power? Because that, to me, is like, maybe that is the framing I might want to use. That is where our biggest challenge is. We tend to learn to grow our power much more quickly than we grow our awareness or our wisdom. And those things really need to be, really, to my mind, power and love are two sides of the same coin. And if we only grow one of them and not the other, we're going to run into some massive problems. And I think that's what we're running into in the world today. The thing that I am interested in is, how do we have deeply democratic conversations about this without, relying overly on anybody's idea in particular about what should happen or needs to happen? I think, that's part of why I feel so sort of privileged and honored to be invited to be talking with you about this, because I think you're doing that right now, like in the way that you're asking this question of people: what is the purpose of public education? And then, like, the more challenging thing, how do we do that in a public forum, town hall, civic conversation situation? Because when I look at the world and I see all of the crises that we're facing, I think underneath all of them is a fundamental crisis of human relationship, and specifically a crisis of how human relationship tends to show up in systems that were not built for humanity. And I think the way into that mess is to attempt to hold conversations across difference and among similarity in ways that are compassionate, sometimes fiercely compassionate, in ways that are loving, sometimes critical love. But coming back to what you're talking about, accountability, and I guess I would love to hear from you too. Like, I think accountability is such a big word, and I think sometimes it can be misused. I think there is such a thing as accountability abuse, or the idea of accountability being turned into abuse, when I think accountability could point to a much more beautiful and wonderful thing. And I think really is, just like you, that's where this conversation is also bringing me. It makes me want to ask you more about your thoughts about accountability and what that means for you, and how that shows up in your work.
Well, even connecting accountability to democracy. Isn't there something there about having a responsibility to the other, or to the world, to my community, to my family? A few weeks ago, I had come across this little factoid that 60% of the globe is under totalitarian rule currently. And as I think about and witness American democracy kind of ebb and flow, I get real nervous. And even considering the history of American democracy, politically, as a very conservative, very kind of right leaning, when I read things, some years ago, like I just consumed Noam Chomsky for a good decade, and really thought about, where's the needle of America in terms of even just this binary frame of liberal and conservative, right? So what we call a liberal nation really lands in the needles in conservative, right? My partner's Dutch, and I think about what that kind of democratizing does for its people, such as public health care. And no mom has to worry or have anxiety about taking their child to the doctor or the dentist or some of, just these hugely just overwhelming for parents, right? These just to care for your child, just to get them access to healthcare, right? So, I mean, this conversation does lead into these bigger social, social stratification, really, right? We get back to the haves and the have-nots. And so if public ed has the rich and the poor, has, of multiracial, undertaking here. I think our queer youth right now are just shaking things up in terms of questioning even a binary.
Yeah.
Right. As I think historically, right, Jim Crow, even, just the concept, the belief, the mental model, the really heartfelt truth, some would say, that Black folk and white folk cannot be intermingling, dating, right, procreating, right, marrying, just coming together in love. That was like the really hard truth, some would say at the time. And now I think our young people are shaking up a gender binary. And, even for me as a cisgendered heterosexual Gen Xer, really rocking my brain around this binary that I was brought up in. And for the men that I come in, really hard kind of hyper masculine, leaning on that side of the binary. That's what I've had to adopt and trying to unlearn that now, and really taking the lead from the young people. We're saying, why the hell a gender binary? Why fix me and lock me into this thing that I am not? So talk about, who am I? They are profoundly, I think, wise in honoring and noticing and being aware that this is being put on me, this idea, this, just the other day, I had a group of teachers and I said, everybody finish the sentence. Boys don't, and everybody knows the answer is cry, right? Where do we get that from, right? And Tony Porter writes that at about 5 years old, boys are cut off from emotion. And what do you know? That's also when we start school. So I think there's something in this conversation around inviting in all these perspectives, especially this intergenerational nature, and not the idea that we as adults are going to pour knowledge into the young people and that's how it goes, but that they're actually constructing knowledge and bringing their own experience into the world with us. And for me, the part about accountability is really my personal relationships mostly. But I get to serve in the state juvenile prison and have been there for 10 years with a Latino culture group. And clearly, right, these young men have committed some crimes, some serious crimes, some severe harm. And I want to contextualize those choices. How were they made? I often ask a young person, like, were you sober when you committed your crime? No, they're desperate. They're strung out. They're not well, right? They're not well. And these are young men. They're committing their crime at 14, 15, 16, and they're being incarcerated for 15, 30 years. What was the state of being when you did this harm, right? So first acknowledging that, but also coming to terms with, like, I did that harm, and the people I have harmed, may or may not forgive me, but how do I hold that in myself? Mm-hmm. And there's a whole exploration there that I've found that cultural healing pathways can foster this. I don't know even so much of it's self-forgiveness, but to foster this healing ways from, just pausing and bringing the awareness of smudging of ceremony and opening to the directions of the sweat lodge, the Temazcal, the sweat lodge, right? Which is just ancient for us, right? And given to us by our ancestors, this practice. And I'm so grateful that I get to practice that with them in there. It's profoundly meaningful for my existence to be with these young men in this way and to continually use the word healing. How does public education teach us to heal or keep us from healing, right? There's a whole another.
Oh, totally, yeah. Does both. Yeah. As you speak about the youth and the wisdom of youth and going outside of the binary and returning to ceremony and healing, I mean, that's in my general experience in public education, like completely lacking, never being had. And I feel tingles up and down my body about the power of what you're speaking about. And I think what it brings me to thinking in particular about this reciprocity of teaching and learning between youth and elders, right? It's like youth bring in a degree of wisdom that we all desperately need, and elders and people who've lived in the world also bring wisdom for them. And how do we establish that reciprocal, respectful, mutual relationship with one another? And it also, just going back to this idea that, what if humanity's crises are really located at their root in a crisis of relationship, and specifically how relationship shows up in human systems, then it could be that what we're attempting to do in public education is really like the location of humanity's greatest project, right? Like, how do we come together in space? And because our technology is phenomenal, like we have incredible technologies, like the extraordinary exponential advances in AI technologies right now, our ability to put people out into outer space. We have we have extraordinary, I think we have all the technologies we need. We have all the policies, everything is there. The question is, how do we implement together in a way that is based in mutuality and is based really in the way that the earth relates to us, is based in a way that says, I sustain and I see all and I care for all. And this, I don't know, I find myself profoundly moved by that possibility, and to hear from youth, and because it's such an ongoing, we are just one piece of a much longer lineage and a much longer history toward.
This is a story I heard years ago. He sends his students out and he says, all right, go touch green life, just a plant, a grass, a tree, just go be with it for a moment, touch it, come back. How did it go? Processing. He says, okay, do this one more time. But this time I want you to ask permission of the tree before you engage. Mm-hmm. And they all go do that, and they come back and say, what is that experience? And my understanding of indigenous practice is protocols to remind us of how to be in a good way, how to be good people, and asking permission is a huge part of that. Mm. With your permission, and then we proceed. For taking in a meal with your permission, with the gratitude, then we proceed. Right. But that pause moment, that awareness moment, that consent moment, when I was taught, even as we bring in the drum song and the animals can drum, and we have deer and elk and horse, and, what I've been taught and I tell the students is that just in yourself, in your own heart, just ask permission before you play the drum, ask permission of the drum. It doesn't have to be this big old, thing that you're giving out to. It's just in you and the drum and with the drum. And those moments, right, that I think bring back this practice of our humanity, of being in relation. Wow, I really appreciate where this conversation has gone. I think it's so rich. Thank you. I'm curious if you could have like a call to action for next steps and thinking about what public education can be. I think at its best, it's not doing this. Systematically, I don't think it's fostering these healing ways, or actually, I think it's doing the harm, right? And that's what students say. I don't heal at school. School's doing the harm that I need to heal from for some experiences. And for others, it's very empowering and enriching. And many of us both, right? We're having these polar experiences in this one institution. But I think it does happen in relation, in moments where there's coaches or teachers that are connected individually. So I want to broaden the question is like, how do we do this, systemically? But I think there are life-giving relationships from, students going through a crisis, and they can reach out to a teacher and be guided and consoled and empowered, in many instances, one-on-one, or maybe one to a small group, but it's not happening largely in classrooms or as a whole collective. So what calls to action? I mean, what could you think about our listeners doing? Okay, they listened to this. It was a very curious conversation. What would be the next step?
I often think questions like this, like one of the most simple answers is like smile at your neighbor. Like, I think it really comes down to really simple acts of community and connection. Like, I think there's this really phenomenal theorist around technology named Douglas Rushkoff, who says that social control is based on creating social disconnection and then exploiting the disorientation and pain that arises from that disconnection. And that's just the truth about how social control works. That is like the essence of it. And so anytime we can engage with each other, and sometimes, of course, we need to have critical, difficult conversations with each other. But the question is it creating connection in the long term? Like, in the short term, it might create some disconnection, but does it create the possibility of deeper healing and connection? So when you ask about what's the call to action for public ed, I think it's create connection action in the communities that we are serving as much as we humanly and possibly can. I think for people who are interested in systems transformation, there's also a need for us to be deeply invested in our own personal transformation. As you were talking about the elder who asks at the age of 80, who am I? That is like an ongoing question that I think all of us need to be asking. And are my behaviors and actions creating the type of impact on the world that I'm looking for? And so there's that. And I think the two other things I would just say briefly, one is I have to say openly that our system really unethically and unwisely uses data in driving its decision making, and that is profoundly violent, and the impacts, the way that it ripples out on young people. The most powerful form of data that I have ever witnessed is the way that a young person walks when they walk out of graduation. The look in their eye that says, I know who I am, I know where I'm going, I know what I want. Even if I didn't pass a standardized test or I didn't do this thing well, I know who I am, and I know that I am offering value to my community. That to me is so much more important than graduating, going to Harvard and working Wall Street. Who are you and how are you offering back to community? That's the data that I'm curious about. And that does not get picked up by our system almost at all. And then the other thing that I have to say just openly is that the federal policy agenda in the United States is driven largely by neoliberal theology. It is an international effort. Lois Weiner, who's a researcher, calls it GERM, the Global Education Reform Movement. And that drives a lot of our policy, unfortunately. And when you ask Pasi Sahlberg about what they were doing in Finland when they got all those rave reviews, he said, yeah, we were just using the research about what creates good educational outcomes that was produced by your universities. You're not using that research. It says, put equity first. That's what the research says. It does not say create competition and violence and scarcity of resources between schools and communities. That's not what it says. And that's what we're doing. So I think we of course we have to have systems awareness, but we also have to be clear about what are we, what's in our sphere of awareness, what's in our sphere of concern, what's in our sphere of influence, and what's in our sphere of control. And we have a certain limited amount of energy, so we have to use that energy wisely. What I was talking about earlier, we have to use the power that we have in accordance with the level of wisdom and love that we have. So really, the key call to action is what we were talking about earlier, is like, let's have civic dialogues. Let's learn to hold space with one another across difference. And let's learn to work on the triggers that come for all of us when we have to disagree with people about very important issues. That to me is because we can't, it does not seem to me that we can do that very well in this country at this time. I think that is a real risk for all of us, not only in terms of public education, but just our national politics going forward.
Thank you. There's a lot there. Thank you. I like to close these conversations with the consideration of your own educational experience. How did schooling, your own K-12, especially public ed, impact you? I
mean, I knew I wanted to be a teacher since I was in second grade. So something must have been like, oh, this looks interesting. At the same time, when I left it, it worked for me. I'm a very privileged person. The system was built for people like me. So it worked, it got me what I needed economically, got me a job and everything. But when I look back on it, I also realize how it also did not work for me in ways like I experienced a lot of abuse in public schools as a function of bullying. There was nobody who ever in my schooling career that I can remember asked me, who are you and what do you want? And how can we tailor this experience for you? And I think that's the lack of that made me want to do it better. I certainly enjoyed college much more than I enjoyed high school and middle school, just the freedom to explore. So I think on the surface, it looked like it worked for me, and it did, certainly. And underneath, when I really think about it, it's also traumatizing. It was traumatizing to not be supported in community or be seen for who I was and supported towards some of the higher goals that I've had in life. So it's both. I think I would say.
Thank you. I really appreciate that reflection. Well, thank you, James. It's been a really rich dialogue, and I look forward to more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vincent. This has really been wonderful.